Bangladesh, the big story is undoubtedly the stock market probe, whose 300-page report is being submitted. A high-powered committee investigating the debacle at Bangladesh's bourse early this year has found heavy manipulation in the stock market and has blamed the market regulator for failing to oversee the situation. Interestingly, some of the cases stated in the stock market probe report may go to the Anti-Corruption Commission for further investigation.
The Dhaka Stock Exchange scene is a little murkier than before. Bangladesh seems to be facing a liquidity crisis. In spite of repeated assurances from the finance minister and the vulnerable stock market scenario, the country is facing multiple challenges. The central bank governor has just requested the commercial banks not to raise their lending rates, and at the same time has also stated that the government has sought more concessional credit in the form of foreign aid to cover import financing and to curb inflation. Meanwhile, a high-powered committee investigating the debacle at Bangladesh's bourse early this year has found heavy manipulation in the stock market and has blamed the market regulator for failing to oversee the situation. Constituted just weeks back, the three-member panel has made a series of recommendations for a major overhaul of the Regulatory Securities and Exchange Commission, including the replacement of its current chairman. The 300-page probe report submitted by Ibrahim Khalid, the probe commander chief, has shocked the nation. The report has sparked off controversies beyond expectations. The opposition party BNP has demanded the resignation of the finance minister and the Bangladesh bank governor, while the former has announced further probes into the scam to a certain criminal offence. But it's the small investors who have suffered the most. Insider trading, irregularities in placement shares, overvaluations have all caused the biggest shocks to the market. The report has revealed 7 case studies accompanied by recommendations and a summary for the government to review. The violators belong to both the ruling and the opposing parties. However, the two names that have cropped up in the probe exposure are of business tycoon Mr. Salman F. Rahman and Mr. Roqibur Rahman, the ex-chief of DSE. The committee report has suggested that the DSE should be careful about these two players and have also warned being misguided by both of them. But unfortunately, experts have opined that violators cannot be punished, just as violators of 1996 have not yet been punished, simply because there are major loopholes in the legal system that allow lapses to occur. Thus, in the absence of proper laws in place, the market is going to continue being vulnerable. Meanwhile, the probe chief Ibrahim Khalid has been quoted and misquoted by media off and on. For instance, on Thursday night, he was seen to have said that drastic actions against violators can only be taken in undemocratic practices such as during martial law. Democratic governments, on the other hand, have to go through proper judicial practices to ensure justice and fairness.
Meanwhile, the Sri Lankan government has rejected a report commissioned by the United Nations on alleged human rights violations at the end of the country's war 2 years ago. The report by a panel of rights experts has just been submitted to the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and to the government in Colombo. Human rights groups are demanding that the report be made public.
End of 2009 and a 3-decade-long civil war ended in Sri Lanka, with LTTE being wiped out by government-appointed military forces. Sri Lankan President Mahendra Rajapaksa thereby claimed that the country took its first step towards a real democracy. Just months after the bloody war, the country voted in favor of Mahendra Rajapaksa to continue with his second term as the president of the country. But all said and done, a war is always a war. Thus, questions were raised about the human rights violations during the war. Sri Lanka's government denies any war crimes were committed, but human rights groups say both the government and the Tamil Tigers, who were seeking to set up a separate Tamil state, were guilty of rights violations. On May 23, 2009, shortly after the end of the war, President Mahinda Rajapaksa endorsed a statement promising UN Chief Ban Ki-moon that the government would investigate alleged laws of war violations. Almost 2 years later, however, United Nations say the government has not taken any serious steps. 2 ad hoc bodies established by the government after the conflict have failed to lead to any criminal investigations, let alone prosecutions.
The reports from Bahrain overnight are deeply troubling.
A committee of experts created by the Sri Lankan government in November 2009 in response to a United States State Department report on wartime abuses never finished its work or published any report. A second body, the Lessons Learned and the Reconciliation Commission, was only empowered to hold hearings, not to conduct serious investigations. It had no program to protect victims or witnesses who testified before it, and it demonstrated a strong government bias in the conduct of its hearings. Its interim recommendations in September 2010 did not contain a single recommendation related to justice or accountability. It is slated to submit its report to the government in May this year. Thus, later United Nations launched its own investigation. And now the panel entrusted with the responsibility has delivered its report to Ban Ki-moon. The report by the 3-member panel, whose appointment was strongly criticized by the Sri Lankan government, was not immediately made public. In a statement on Tuesday, Human Rights Watch, the New York-based rights monitor body, said that almost 2 years after the war, Sri Lanka had taken no steps to hold anyone on either side of the conflict accountable for serious violations of international law. Sri Lankan officials continue to insist, despite mounting evidences to the contrary, that the Sri Lankan armed forces committed no violations during the conflict's final months. In response to the release of the latest US annual human rights report on April 8, which, among other allegations, said that extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances continued to be a problem in Sri Lanka, a military spokesman said that all these allegations are baseless. Meanwhile, United Nations has said the report will be made public soon. But question now remains, will things at all change? Will Sri Lanka ever get to know the fact, or will this report be considered as an interference into its sovereignty?
Towards the end of the week, another big thing happened in India. Rights activist Vinayak Sen was granted bail on Friday by the Supreme Court of India. The apex court questioned his conviction and life sentence for sedition, saying he could be a sympathizer for the Naxalites and nothing beyond that. While granting bail to the 61-year-old social worker, bench of Justices H.S. Bedi and C.K. Prasad observed that no case of sedition could be made out of the charges against Sen. Remember, Sen was recently held guilty by a trial court in Chhattisgarh for helping Naxalites to set up a network. Meanwhile, even as activists celebrated Vinayak Sen's bail, Chhattisgarh Chief Minister Raman Singh said this was not a setback in the state's war against the Maoists. For more on that, let's quickly connect to Sauman, who has been following the story very closely.
Thank you, Indro. India's Supreme Court has granted bail to leading public health specialist and human rights activist Vinayak Sen. In December, a court in the central state of Chhattisgarh sentenced him to life in prison for helping Maoist rebels. The lower court had found him guilty of carrying messages and setting up bank accounts for the rebels who are active in large parts of India. Right groups in India and abroad had called on the government to free him. Indra, let's just look back and see how things panned out in the last 3 to 4 years. On May 14, 2007, Vinayak Sen was arrested in Bilaspur on charges of carrying messages between Piyush Goa, a businessman, and Narayan Sanyal, a Maoist ideologue. The day after, Sen was remanded to judicial custody. Then on May 25th, Chhattisgarh government claimed that Sen is a threat to state security. Bail was not immediately granted to him. The issue drew tremendous outrage from civil rights activists, and between May and June 2007, activists rallied across India in Sen's support. Then almost for a year, Vinayak Sen was kept in solitary and confinement. Prison authorities, however, claimed it was for his own personal security. On August 11, 2008, the second bail petition was filed in Chhattisgarh High Court in Bilaspur. And on August 14, first hearing on bail took place, but later the hearing was adjourned. Finally, on December 2, 2008, the bail petition was dismissed. But Supreme Court issued notice to Chhattisgarh government on May 4, 2009, questioning Sen's detention and demanded its response in 2 weeks. The court also asked for the best medical care to be provided for Sen's weak heart condition. And on May 25th, the same year, Sen was released on bail by Supreme Court vacation bench of Justice Markade Kachu and Justice Deepak Verma. But afterwards, in November 2009, Sen's trial resumed once again. The following year, in August to September 2010, Supreme Court directed the Chhattisgarh government to complete its presentation on evidences against Binayak Sen by end of September. And on September 28, prosecution concluded presenting its evidence. On December 24, 2010, Raipur Sessions Court found Binayak Sen, Sanyal and Guha guilty of sedition and conspiracy and was sentenced all three to life imprisonment. Finally, on January 24 this year, Sen's bail application hearing began in Chhattisgarh High Court. Ram Jethmalani was the judge who opened the arguments for Sen, terming the trial court verdict a case of no evidence. A day after, on January 25th, another lawyer, Surendra Singh, argued in favor of Sen, telling the court that documents were planted by Chhattisgarh police to establish Sen's link to Maoist. And finally, after a series of hearings on April 15th, that is this week, Supreme Court finally granted bail to Binayak Sen.